I didn't wake up screaming. There was no panic attack, no dramatic moment, no sudden collapse of everything I knew. I woke up the way I always did, quietly, automatically, already tired of a day that hadn't started yet. The realization came later, while I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee I didn't remember making. I was 40 years old. That number didn't scare me. What scared me was how little it meant. No resistance. No emotion. Just a flat acknowledgement, like reading the weather. That's when it hit me, I hadn't been living my life. I had been maintaining it. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. That was the most dangerous part. I had a routine. A history. People who knew me well enough to assume I was fine. I had responsibilities, habits, explanations ready for every question. What I didn't have was ownership. Somewhere along the way, without any single catastrophic mistake, I had handed my life over to momentum. And momentum had taken it places I never consciously chose. I used to believe that big regrets come from big mistakes. From reckless decisions, ruined relationships, dramatic failures. I was wrong. The deepest regret grows quietly, inside a life that works. It starts with small compromises. With choosing the sensible option one too many times. With postponing what matters because there's always something more urgent, more practical, more acceptable to deal with first. I remember when I stopped asking myself what I wanted. It wasn't a conscious decision. It happened gradually, like losing sensitivity in a limb you don't use. I replaced desire with obligation, curiosity with caution, hope with planning. People praised me for it. That made it easier. You're so grounded. You're realistic. You've got your life together. Each compliment pushed me further away from myself. I told myself that dreams are for younger people. That wanting more is immature. That stability is the real reward. I believed it because it sounded responsible and because it excused my fear. Fear of failing. Fear of being judged. Fear of discovering that the life I wanted would require courage I wasn't sure I had. So I stayed. I stayed in jobs that didn't inspire me because they were reliable. I stayed in conversations that bored me because they were familiar. I stayed silent about my dissatisfaction because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. Gratitude became my cage. Every time a quiet voice inside me whispered that this wasn't enough, I answered it with logic. With lists. With comparisons to people who had it worse. I convinced myself that dissatisfaction was a flaw in my character, not a signal. That voice didn't disappear. It waited. Years passed faster than I expected. Not because time sped up, but because I wasn't paying attention. Days blurred together. Milestones lost their meaning. I started measuring life in obligations completed instead of moments felt. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen, not because they don't care, but because you no longer show them anything real. I had become excellent at presenting a version of myself that required no questions. Inside, something was eroding. Not loudly. Not painfully. Just steadily. I stopped being curious about the future. I stopped imagining alternatives. I stopped believing that change was possible without destruction. And because I didn't want to destroy anything, I chose to preserve everything exactly as it was. That's how you lose decades without noticing. The morning it finally surfaced, it wasn't triggered by tragedy. It was triggered by emptiness. I realized that if my life continued exactly like the same routines, same rhythms, same compromises, nothing would technically be wrong. And that thought filled me with quiet horror. Because a life that is merely acceptable can still be unbearable. I looked around my kitchen, my apartment, the carefully built structure of my days, and understood something I had been avoiding for years. This life made sense. It just didn't feel like mine. And the most painful part wasn't that I had failed. It was that I had succeeded at the wrong thing. I didn't know yet what I would do with that realization. I only knew that once you see the truth about your own life, continuing without change becomes a form of self-betrayal. That morning, for the first time in years, I didn't rush to distract myself. I sat there and let the weight of it settle. And somewhere beneath the regret, beneath the fear, beneath the grief for all the time I couldn't get back, another feeling emerged, quiet, unfamiliar, and dangerous. Clarity. After that morning, I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. The silence in my life wasn't peaceful, it was empty. The routines I once called stability were just repetitions I no longer questioned. Even my memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else who had once lived inside my body and quietly moved out. I began revisiting moments I had dismissed as insignificant at the time. There was a decision I didn't take because it felt irresponsible. A relationship I didn't pursue because it would have complicated my plans. A version of myself I postponed because now wasn't the right time. Every time, I told myself I was being mature. What I was really doing was deferring my life indefinitely. The hardest realization wasn't that I had lost time. It was that I had lost momentum. Desire doesn't die dramatically, it withers when it isn't fed. And once it's gone, reviving it feels unnatural, almost embarrassing, like trying to remember a language you were once fluent in. I started asking myself questions I hadn't allowed before. What did I actually enjoy? What would I choose if no one were watching? Who would I be if practicality wasn't the highest virtue? The answers didn't come easily. At first, they didn't come at all. I had built my identity around being reliable, reasonable, low maintenance. Those qualities had earned me trust, but they had also made me invisible to myself. When you live for a long time without friction, you forget how to recognize direction. There was a grief that settled in then, not sharp, but heavy. Grief for the version of me who once believed life would expand naturally if I just followed the rules. Grief for the risks I never took because they didn't come with guarantees. I wasn't angry at my past self. I understood them too well. They were trying to survive. They were trying to be accepted. They were trying to avoid pain. And in doing so, they had chosen a life that minimized loss at the cost of depth. The moral dilemma emerged slowly, but once it did, it refused to be ignored. Should I accept this life as the result of my choices and learn to be content with it, or should I disrupt everything I had built in pursuit of something that might not even exist anymore? Change, at this point, would be expensive. It wouldn't just affect me. It would confuse people. Disappoint them. Force explanations I wasn't sure I could articulate without sounding ungrateful or unstable. There is a certain age after which reinvention is seen not as courage, but as crisis. I felt the weight of that judgment before it even happened. I imagined conversations where I would try to explain myself and hear my own words sound thin, indulgent, insufficient. I just wasn't happy. Feels inadequate when you can't point to a clear failure. When everything works. That's the trap. When nothing is broken, you're expected to endure. For weeks, I lived in that tension. Outwardly unchanged. Internally unraveling. I did what I had always done, I performed normalcy. But now it felt like acting in a play I no longer believed in. At night, I lay awake calculating futures. One where I stayed exactly as I was, growing older, calmer, quieter, increasingly disconnected from any sense of urgency. Another where I chose disruption, uncertainty, risk, and the possibility of regret of a different kind. Neither future promised happiness. That's something people rarely admit. Choosing yourself doesn't guarantee joy. It only guarantees honesty. And honesty is frightening when you've built a life around avoidance. I began to notice a subtle bitterness in myself. Not toward others, but toward the days themselves. Each morning felt like a continuation rather than a beginning. Time wasn't passing, it was accumulating. I realized then that staying was no longer neutral. Staying meant accepting that this was the full extent of my life. That the quiet dissatisfaction I felt was something I would manage until the end, like a chronic condition. Leaving whatever that meant would hurt. It would destabilize everything. It might even fail. But staying had already failed me slowly, thoroughly, and without spectacle. The question shifted from what if I regret changing to what if I regret never trying. That question didn't let me rest. I understood that no one was coming to save me from this life. No dramatic event would arrive to justify change. If I wanted something different, I would have to choose it without permission, without applause, and without certainty. That realization was both terrifying and clarifying. Because for the first time, the cost of doing nothing became higher than the cost of acting. I wasn't ready yet. But I was no longer asleep. And that meant the life I had been maintaining was already beginning to crack. The decision didn't arrive as courage. It arrived as acceptance. I accepted that there would be no perfect moment. No external validation. No sudden permission slip from the world telling me it was finally reasonable to want more. I accepted that whatever I chose next would feel late, awkward, and unjustified to people who hadn't lived inside my head. That acceptance changed everything. I stopped waiting to feel ready. Instead of asking whether I was brave enough to change, I asked a different question: was I willing to continue like this if nothing ever changed at all? And for the first time, the answer was clear. No. The first step wasn't dramatic. It was almost embarrassingly small. I said no to something I would normally agree to automatically. No explanation. No apology. Just no. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument, but I didn't rush to fill it. That silence was new territory. Then I made another choice, one that didn't make sense on paper but felt unmistakably mine. It disrupted a plan I had been following for years. It unsettled people who were used to my predictability. It unsettled me too. I felt selfish, reckless, immature, and strangely, alive. The guilt didn't disappear. It changed shape. Instead of guilt for wanting something different, I felt guilt for how long I had denied myself the right to want anything at all. That guilt was quieter, more honest. It didn't paralyze me, it pushed me forward. I began dismantling my life the way I had once built it, carefully, deliberately, without spectacle. I let go of obligations that existed only because I had never questioned them. I loosened commitments that no longer aligned with who I was becoming. Some people reacted with confusion. Others with concern. A few with disappointment thinly disguised as advice. I listened without defending myself. For the first time, I didn't need to be understood immediately. What surprised me most was how much resistance came from inside. My own voice tried to pull me back into familiar arguments. This is irresponsible. This is too late. This won't work. Those thoughts didn't vanish, but they stopped being in control. I wasn't chasing happiness. I was choosing congruence. There were moments of fear so sharp they made me doubt everything. Moments when the old life tempted me with its comfort and predictability. Moments when I wondered whether I had mistaken restlessness for truth. But even on the hardest days, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer felt like a guest in my own existence. Time began to feel different. Slower. Heavier. More present. Days didn't blur as easily when I was actually paying attention. I noticed my reactions again. My preferences. My limits. Things I had overridden for years resurfaced, tentative but persistent. I didn't reinvent myself. I reintroduced myself. There was grief, real grief, for the years I couldn't reclaim. For the paths permanently closed. For the version of me who believed that life would eventually start without requiring a decision. I let myself feel it without trying to resolve it into a lesson. Not everything has a lesson. Some things are simply lost. But regret, I learned, is not only about the past. It's also a warning system for the future. It tells you where you stopped listening to yourself. It tells you what happens when fear masquerades as wisdom for too long. I don't know how my life will look in 10 years. That uncertainty used to terrify me. Now it feels honest. I would rather face an unknown future than continue living a known life that doesn't belong to me. Here is the quiet truth I carry now: you don't wake up one day and realize your life isn't yours. You realize it slowly through numbness, through repetition, through the absence of anticipation. And by the time the realization fully arrives, the cost of ignoring it is unbearable. I didn't start over because I believed it would make me happy. I started over because continuing would have meant slowly disappearing while technically staying alive. If you're listening to this and waiting for a sign, this isn't it. There is no sign coming. There is only the question you already know the answer to, and the courage to live with that answer once you stop pretending you don't hear it. I woke up at 40 and realized my life wasn't mine. I didn't get my time back. But I stopped losing it. And for now, that is enough.